Chapter 1: The Reluctant Whistleblower. He described a reactor powered by an element that shouldn't exist, a craft that flew by, falling through space, and a secret buried deep in the Nevada desert. This is the story of Bob Lazar. The desert stretches endlessly in every direction, dry, silent, and humming, with an air of profound mystery. Somewhere in the Nevada wilderness, past a chain of forgotten dirt roads and behind barbed wire fences, begins the strange and unsettling story of Bob Lazar. Robert Scott Lazar wasn't always a household name in UFO circles. For much of his early life, he tried to blend into the background. Born on January 26, 1959, and raised in Coral Gables, Florida, Bob was a self-proclaimed tinkerer who developed a fascination with technology at a young age. Rocket engines, electronics, lasers, if it had wires or could explode, Bob was drawn to it. By the early 1980s, he had moved west, eventually landing in Las Vegas. There, he claimed to work as a physicist at the prestigious Los Alamos National Laboratory, contributing to highly classified projects. Official records from Los Alamos are murky. Some claim he never worked there. Others insist he was there on a subcontract. What is certain is this: Lazar would soon become the center of one of the most controversial claims in modern history. It was 1989 when he went public, appearing on Las Vegas television under the alias Dennis, his face hidden in shadow. Lazar made a startling announcement. He said he had worked on alien spacecraft at a facility known only as S4, a secret base near the infamous Area 51. According to Lazar, the U.S. government was in possession of 9 extraterrestrial craft, 9 flying saucers of unknown origins, stored in hangars carved into the mountainside at S4. His job, he claimed, was to help reverse engineer the propulsion system of one of these incredible vehicles. The system he described was unlike anything known to modern science. It ran on a mysterious element called Element 115, an isotope that did not exist on Earth. This element allegedly produced gravity waves, bending space-time itself and allowing the craft to move instantaneously from one point to another to the casual viewer. Lazar seemed calm and articulate, not a wide-eyed fantasist, but a reluctant whistleblower. He spoke with precision, describing the inner workings of the saucer, the layout of the base, and the nature of his security clearance. He even described advanced biometric hand scanners, decades before such technology became widespread. Skeptics, of course, attacked his credibility. His educational records, allegedly from Caltech and MIT, were missing. There were no diplomas, no yearbook entries, no student rosters listing his name. Lazar claimed the government had erased all trace of his past to discredit him, whether that erasure was real or a fabrication. The ambiguity only deepened the mystery around the man who dared to speak of impossible things. Chapter 2: The Silent Hangars of S4. He reached out and touched the cold, seamless metal of a craft not of this world, a moment that would divide his life into a before and an after. This was his entry into S4. The road to S4, according to Lazar, was like entering another dimension. After intense background checks, polygraphs, and security clearances, he was driven in a blacked-out bus from the outskirts of Groom Lake to the base itself. The windows were covered to obscure the route. Only those who already knew the way could ever find it. Lazar described the first time he saw the hangars. They looked like part of the mountain, he said, camouflaged, seamless, as if nature had folded itself around them. The massive doors opened with silent precision, and inside was a sight that would change his life forever. 9 craft of different sizes and designs. Some were classic flying saucers. Others were more angular, with organic shapes that defied conventional engineering. The one he was assigned to, he called the sport model, sleek, compact, and metallic. It seemed to shimmer faintly, as if bending the very light around it. The sport model stood on its own landing gear in the center of the hangar. It had no visible seams, bolts, or rivets, no signs of traditional human construction. When Lazar was first allowed to approach, he reached out to touch it. The surface was cold and smooth, like brushed steel, but somehow lighter. He was told to observe, not interfere. His primary task was to reverse engineer the propulsion system, to understand how it worked without ever being fully told where it came from. But the implications were obvious. Inside, everything was scaled strangely. The ceilings were low, the chairs small, designed perhaps for beings of shorter stature. The interior was minimalist, no control panels, no wires, just smooth, curved walls and a single central column that extended from the floor to the ceiling. That column, he was told, was the reactor, the heart of the propulsion system. Lazar claimed the craft used 3 gravity amplifiers, positioned in a triangle beneath the floor. These amplifiers emitted gravitational waves that could be directed and manipulated. This wasn't propulsion in the traditional sense. It was distortion. By bending the fabric of space-time itself, the craft could move, not by flying, but by falling into the warped space ahead of it. It would compress the space in front and expand the space behind, allowing for near instantaneous movement. There was no sound, no exhaust, just a graceful, silent drift. The source of this incredible power was the reactor, powered by element 115. At the time, this element didn't exist on the periodic table. Lazar claimed it was stable in the form found inside the reactor, creating a small, powerful energy source that required no cooling and emitted no radiation. He never claimed to fully understand it. His team was compartmentalized. He wasn't allowed to speak to engineers working on the craft's metallurgy or its control systems. Everyone had a narrow focus. The left hand was never meant to know what the right hand was doing. This isolation bred unease. Lazar described an atmosphere of intense paranoia. Armed guards patrolled every hallway, conversations were monitored, and employees were warned never to discuss their work off-site. Infractions were met with immediate termination or worse. Once, Lazar claimed he was shown a live test flight. The sport model lifted off the ground effortlessly, floated silently, then zipped off at an angle that defied all known laws of inertia. It moved like a leaf on water fluid, unpredictable and alive. It made no noise, just a faint vibration in the chest, like the hum of a distant turbine. In that moment, watching it hover, Bob Lazar realized this wasn't technology stolen from a rival nation. This was something else entirely. Chapter 3. The Night they saw the light. He knew he was risking everything, but he had to show them. He had to have witnesses. That decision led to a silent, glowing orb performing impossible maneuvers in the desert sky. Bob Lazar knew he was violating his security clearance. He knew the consequences could be catastrophic. But fear and curiosity are powerful forces. He had seen something beyond imagination, and he could no longer keep it to himself. One night, he gathered a small group of trusted friends, including fellow physicist Gene Huff. They met outside Las Vegas and drove out into the vast, empty darkness of the Nevada test site, just miles from the edge of restricted government land. Their destination was a spot overlooking Papoose Lake, near the Groom Lake complex, a place where Lazar claimed test flights of the alien craft routinely occurred. He had chosen a Wednesday night for a reason. According to him, that was when the tests happened. Armed with camcorders and binoculars, they settled into position, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation, cloaked by the desert night. And then they saw it, a glowing orb, bright and utterly silent, lifted into the sky above the mountains. It hovered motionless, then darted. Its movement was unlike any conventional aircraft, smooth, fluid, and completely without inertia, just as Lazar had described. The group was stunned. They filmed what they could, their shaky footage capturing only small, glowing lights against the black sky. But for them, it was everything. It was confirmation. Bob Lazar was not lying, but their excursions did not go unnoticed. On a subsequent trip, they were intercepted. Armed military personnel appeared from the darkness, detaining them on the spot. Their names were taken, their cameras seized. Lazar was brought in for questioning. He was confronted with transcripts of his own phone calls, proof that his communications were being monitored. He was warned sternly never to return. The message was clear. His involvement with S4 was over. But the surveillance didn't stop. He was followed, harassed, and threatened. In those tense days that followed, Lazar made a fateful decision. If the government intended to silence him, he would speak first loudly, publicly, and without fear. That's when he reached out to George Knapp, an investigative journalist with Las Vegas station KLAS. Knapp had a reputation for tackling unusual stories, but nothing could prepare him for what Lazar was about to share. Chapter 4. The World Listens. He sat before a television camera, his voice altered and his face in shadow, and detailed the most incredible secret of the modern age. Overnight, the world was watching, in a televised interview that would send shockwaves around the globe. Bob Lazar, using the alias Dennis, detailed everything. S4, the craft, the gravity propulsion systems, element 115, and the strict paranoid compartmentalization of the entire operation. The interview exploded into the public consciousness. UFO researchers hailed him as a brave whistleblower. Skeptics dismissed him as a clever hoaxer, but the discussion had irrevocably changed. People who had never heard of S4 or Groom Lake were now asking questions. In the months that followed, Lazar gave more interviews, now with his identity fully revealed. He spoke calmly and consistently, rarely wavering in his details. While some claims were impossible to verify, others began to gain a strange traction. One striking example was the hand scanner. Lazar described a device used at S4 that measured the bone structure of the hand to verify identity. At the time, it sounded like science fiction. But years later, photographs surfaced of an identical device used in high-security military installations. It was a small vindication, but a compelling one. Then there was the matter of element 115. When Lazar first mentioned it in 1989, it was unknown to science. But in 2003, scientists in Russia and the US synthesized a new element, moscovium, with an atomic number of 115. It was unstable, decaying in milliseconds. But Lazar had always insisted the version used in the craft was a stable isotope, something we had yet to replicate. Whether coincidence or confirmation, the discovery gave his claims a strange new relevance. But despite the intense attention, Lazar never seemed to relish the spotlight. He retreated from public life, opening a small business building and selling scientific equipment. He declined most interviews, citing safety concerns and the immense toll the publicity had taken on his life. For decades, he remained mostly silent, but the legend of S4 only grew larger. Chapter 5, The Anatomy of Doubt. They came for his past, his credentials, his very name, systematically picking apart his history in an effort to erase his credibility. The backlash was swift and brutal. When Bob Lazar stepped into the public eye, he expected disbelief. What he didn't anticipate was how thoroughly his life would be unraveled. Journalists, skeptics, and government officials began digging, eager to prove he was a fraud. The first point of attack was his education. Lazar claimed to have degrees from MIT and Caltech, but investigators could find no records, no transcripts, no yearbooks, no student registries. It was as if he had never attended at all. Lazar maintained that his records had been deliberately erased as part of a government effort to discredit him. He pointed to the loss of his employment records at Los Alamos National Laboratory as further evidence. Yet, a 1982 phone book from Los Alamos listed him as a technician, and a newspaper article featured him working on a jet car and particle accelerators. These breadcrumbs suggested he had, at the very least, been employed in advanced scientific work. Still, skeptics seized on the inconsistencies, arguing he was a low-level contractor, not a physicist. Then came the legal trouble. In the early 1990s, Lazar was arrested on charges unrelated to his UFO claims. In the eyes of the public, the eccentric scientist now had a criminal record. For many, it was the final nail in the coffin of his credibility. But for others, it was more reason to believe. They argued that Lazar was being targeted, harassed, and punished for speaking out, that his run-ins with the law were orchestrated to undermine his character. To them, he was a truth-teller under attack. Years passed, and Lazar faded from the spotlight. He settled into running United Nuclear, a scientific supply company. He rarely gave interviews, and when he did, he showed no signs of changing his story. In one rare conversation, he said, "Look, I'm not out to convince anyone. I'm not writing a book. I'm not doing a tour. I'm just telling you what I saw, what I worked on, what I know." There was a strange sincerity to it, calm and unwavering. For believers, That calmness was proof. For doubters, it was the rehearsed delivery of a practiced liar. The man became an enigma, and the truth of his story seemed to depend entirely on who you asked. Chapter 6: A Shadow of Proof. He described technology that bent the laws of physics, and decades later, declassified videos would show Navy pilots encountering objects doing exactly that. The echoes were undeniable as the dust settled around Bob Lazar's claims. The world began to respond with a slow, deliberate ripple that traveled through government corridors, scientific institutions, and popular culture. The mainstream press largely painted him as a deluded man or an opportunist. But a few journalists noted strange coincidences, people who refused to talk, records that had seemingly disappeared, and security details Lazar referenced with uncanny accuracy. The scientific community was divided. Most physicists dismissed his descriptions of gravity manipulation as impossible. But a smaller group felt a spark of curiosity. The propulsion system, Lazar described, while fantastical, aligned eerily with theoretical ideas like space-time curvature and gravitational lensing. He seemed to speak the language of advanced physics in UFO circles. However, Lazar became a foundational figure. His testimony became the skeleton key that seemed to unlock every other UFO narrative, from Roswell to the Rendlesham Forest incident. For nearly 30 years, his story simmered on the back burner of public consciousness. Then, in 2017, the New York Times published a bombshell report. The Pentagon had been secretly funding a UFO research program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, AATIP. Suddenly, Lazar didn't seem so far-fetched. Videos, declassified by the Department of Defense, showed Navy pilots encountering unknown craft objects that moved with instantaneous acceleration, defied inertia, and displayed no visible means of propulsion. Too many, these UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, mirrored the behavior of the sport model Lazar had described decades earlier. Public interest surged. UFOs were no longer a taboo subject. Serious institutions began asking serious questions. And in the background of all this renewed interest, Bob Lazar's name resurfaced. Podcasts, documentaries, and online forums reignited the debate. Was he the original whistleblower, or just an early fabricator who had gotten lucky with a few predictions? The 2018 documentary, Bob Lazar, Area 51, and Flying Saucers, introduced him to a new generation. It showed a man who was weary, reluctant, an intensely private, reluctant whistleblower, burdened by a knowledge he never asked for. The film didn't offer new evidence, but it presented Lazar not as a celebrity, but as a man forever changed by what he had seen. Chapter 7: The Burden of Knowledge. He lived with the constant, low hum of surveillance, the phone clicks, the cars outside, the feeling of being watched. This was the price of his truth. As Bob Lazar's name receded from the headlines, his life never returned to normal. From the moment he spoke out, he had become a marked man, not in a cinematic sense, but in the quieter, subtler way. Lives are changed forever. He opened United Nuclear, his scientific supply company, as an attempt to move on. It sold chemicals, lab glassware, and high-voltage equipment, nothing sensational. But even this was not without complications. He found himself under unusual scrutiny from regulatory agencies, with packages opened and orders delayed in interviews. His demeanor changed from the fiery whistleblower of 1989 to someone more measured and weary. He answered questions cautiously, as if measuring the cost of every word. The harassment, the public ridicule, and the damage to his reputation had taken a toll. Friends had stopped calling. His family felt the weight of the constant questions and the strange cars outside their home. He had cracked a door open to the impossible, and it would never shut again. Yet, despite it all, he never retracted his story, not once. He never sought to capitalize on it with book deals or speaking tours. His interviews remained rare and mostly reluctant. When asked if he feared for his life, he once replied, "Not anymore. After a while, you realize you're just a small piece in a very large puzzle. They don't need to eliminate you. They just need to discredit you." He described strange events with a matter-of-fact tone: phones clicking, computers behaving oddly, helicopters flying low overhead at night. Coincidences? Maybe, or maybe not. He didn't speculate. He simply described the reality of his life. For decades, he refused the spotlight until filmmaker Jeremy Corbell convinced him to tell his story one more time. At the documentary's premiere, Lazar was visibly uncomfortable, his hands trembling slightly. But he spoke, and the room fell silent. He didn't say anything, knew no fresh revelations. He told the same story he'd told 30 years earlier. But something about that unwavering repetition, that refusal to let the myth fade, was powerfully compelling. Over time, Bob Lazar became less a figure of controversy and more a fixture of modern folklore. He wasn't just a man who claimed to have seen alien technology. He was the man who never, ever changed his story. That consistency became his quiet badge of honor. Chapter 8: The Unending Echo. He never asked for belief, only curiosity. And long after the cameras left, his questions continued to echo in the minds of everyone who looked up at the stars and wondered. As the years turned into decades, Bob Lazar's story took on the rhythm of a friend-enduring myth, not because it was fiction, but because it refused to disappear. It stayed alive through quiet repetition, the same phrases, the same details, the same haunting calm in his voice. Strangely, the world around him began to shift in a way that seemed to mirror his claims. The stigma around UFOs continued to erode. Military footage was officially released. Former intelligence officials testified before Congress, and even NASA announced a study into UAPs. Lazar watched from the sidelines. He wasn't campaigning for validation, but he couldn't help but notice how the public discussion now echoed what he had said in 1989. Propulsion with no visible engines, objects with no heat signature, craft that defied known physics. The online community around his story grew. New listeners encountered his old interviews and were struck by his technical precision and lack of melodrama. He didn't speak like a hoaxer. He spoke like a man haunted by something extraordinary. And crucially, he never asked for anything, no money, no fame. He just told his story. Some skeptics softened. They admitted that if Lazar was a hoaxer, he was a remarkably consistent one, and consistency, especially over decades, is hard to fake. It doesn't prove truth, but it demands a certain respect. In his later years, Lazar gave few interviews. His voice was slower, his hair thinner, but his eyes stayed sharp, the same eyes that had once stared into the belly of a gravity-defying machine. When asked what message he'd want to leave behind, he didn't hesitate. "Don't stop asking questions," he said, "and don't assume the truth is what you're told it is. Sometimes it's hidden in the silence." In a world driven by noise, Bob Lazar chose stillness, and in doing so, he became unforgettable. His legacy became something more than evidence. It became a question that refuses to be silenced, a question that keeps you looking up at the sky, even when there's nothing visible, wondering what might be hidden just beyond the edge of our understanding. Chapter 9. The Weight of a Memory. "It's not about belief," he would say, his gaze looking just past the horizon. "It's about what I saw, and once you've seen it, you can't unsee it." That memory was his constant companion as Bob Lazar moved into the later stages of his life. He existed in a space between myth and man. He lived in a modest home, surrounded by a quiet landscape, the trappings of someone who never expected or wanted fame. Inside, among ordinary things, were relics of his past: photos, papers, worn books on physics, and notebooks filled with diagrams few would recognize. Sometimes he would leaf through them, not as a man dwelling on old glories, but as a scientist still trying to make sense of something that remained beyond comprehension. The weight of that memory lived in his posture, in the way he looked into the distance when he thought aloud. Friends and colleagues remarked on his consistent character. He never crumbled under ridicule, never lashed out at critics, and never revised his story to fit new narratives. He simply remained himself. There is a quiet bravery in that, to tell a story the world isn't ready to hear, and to live with the consequences without bitterness. There was a sadness there, too, not self-pity, but a kind of scientific mourning. He had glimpsed a technology of breathtaking elegance, something that could have eliminated the energy crisis and revolutionized our world. And yet it remained locked away, hidden in a desert hangar, he once said. If we had even a partial grasp of how that propulsion worked, we could change everything. But it remained out of reach. Lazar didn't dwell on conspiracies. He stayed grounded, focused on what he could describe with accuracy. He didn't know everything, but what he knew, he shared. In private, he was still that kid who loved to tinker, building small experiments and playing with magnetic fields. The wonder had never left him. It had only deepened. Visitors were often surprised by his simplicity. There was no shrine to UFOs, no alien posters, just a soft-spoken man with keen eyes, a dry wit, and an enduring curiosity. A man who knew that telling the truth doesn't always bring peace. But there were moments, brief and rare, when he seemed content, when he'd stand outside at night, look up at the stars, and say nothing at all. No explanations, no theories, just silence. As if in that silence was the closest thing to understanding he would ever find. Chapter 10. The Final Question. If he could go back, would he do it all again? After a long, thoughtful pause, he nodded. "Yes," he said, because the story is bigger than I am. In the quiet years, Bob Lazar became a symbol, not a loud or flashy one, but the kind that lingers, unchanged and enduring. For the UFO community, he was a compass, not necessarily the answer, but a fixed point that reminded them of the strangeness that might be hiding in plain sight. He gave few interviews in his later years. His voice was slower, more measured, but the look in his eyes, the look of someone who had stared into the impossible, ever faded. During a rare conversation, a journalist asked him one final question. If you could go back and do it all over again, would you still speak out? He paused, a long, thoughtful pause. Then he nodded, double quotes. Yes, he said, because no matter what happened to me, the story is bigger than I am. That phrase explained everything, the risk, the ridicule, the years of suspicion. It lives in you, and eventually it asks to be shared. Toward the end of his life, he rarely spoke of S4 unless prompted. It wasn't out of fear anymore. It was out of reverence, like someone guarding a sacred text. There was a weight to it, but also a strange, enduring beauty, a kind of awe. He never lost at a small science symposium, just a guest in the audience. People noticed him. They gathered slowly, respectfully. No selfies, no flashbulbs, just hushed questions and nods of gratitude. When asked what message he'd want to leave behind, he didn't hesitate. Don't stop asking questions, he said. And don't assume the truth is what you're told it is. Sometimes it's hidden in the silence. Silence. That's what defined Bob Lazar in the end. Not because he didn't speak, but because he left space for mystery, space for others to wonder, to examine, to seek. Bob Lazar wasn't a prophet or a martyr. He was just a man who saw something he couldn't explain, and instead of running from it, he told the world, that's rare, that's brave, and that, whether you believe his story or not, is worth remembering. Because when you lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling or the stars, when you wonder if we're alone, if the sky is hiding something, you'll think of Bob Lazar. And somewhere in the stillness, you might hear a whisper, asterisk, gravity amplifiers, element 115, the sport model, S-4. Asterisk, and maybe, just maybe, that whisper will stay with you, just like it stayed with him. Chapter 11a. Whisper in the desert wind still moves across Groom Lake. The facility, if it ever existed, remains sealed behind fences and sand. But somewhere out there, beyond the dust and stars, something may still hover, silent, waiting. And maybe it remembers the man who tried to speak for it. Bob Lazar's story never truly ended. It simply faded into the collective subconscious of those who listened, like a half-remembered dream that lingers in the morning stillness. Whether you believed every word or simply saw it as a reflection of our yearning for the stars, his words carved a permanent space in the conversation about who we are and what might be watching us. Years passed, governments changed, classified documents were leaked, fighter pilots reported new encounters, and each time the news cycle returned to the question of extraterrestrial life. Lazar's name re-emerged, not shouted, but whispered, as if to say, he told us long ago. His legacy became folklore, not as fiction, but as a story of persistency, tale passed quietly from one truth seeker to another. Younger generations, born long after he spoke out, found themselves captivated not because he had answers, but because he asked the right questions. Asterisk, what is gravity, really? Why hide what we find? What would it mean for us? Asterisk, that's the thing about the Lazar story. It isn't really about saucers. It's about perspective, about how fragile our understanding of reality might be, and how quickly the line between ordinary and impossible can be crossed. Many who encountered his tale didn't walk away convinced, but they did walk away changed. The world suddenly felt bigger, more complex. That sliver of doubt, asterisk, what if he was right? Asterisk, never quite left them. That is the mark of a story with true staying power. In the end, Bob Lazar was a mirror, reflecting our deepest desire to know the unknown, to pull back the curtain and glimpse what lies beyond, even if the view is brief and the image unclear. It still tells us something vital, that we are not done exploring. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, let the mystery settle around you. Let the silence speak, and let the story of Bob Lazar be a soft murmur in the darkness, a reminder that some truths hide not in what we know, but in what we dare to imagine. Chapter 12. The Signal from the Silence. It began not with a crash, but with a sound, a single, perfect tone that descended from the stars and echoed in the mind of a lonely radio astronomer. This is the story of the Ishana signal, the great radio. Telescopes of the Very Large Array stood like silent sentinels in the high desert of New Mexico, their white dishes turned toward the infinite blackness of space. For Dr. Eris Thorne, the night shift was a familiar solitude, a cup of cooling coffee, the hum of servers, and the endless hiss of the cosmos were his only companions. He was mapping hydrogen clouds in a distant arm of the galaxy, a routine task that required patience more than brilliance. But on this night, the silence of the universe was broken. It started as a spike on his monitor, a narrow-band signal so pure and constant it was unlike any natural phenomenon he'd ever seen. It wasn't the chaotic scream of a pulsar or the diffuse whisper of a nebula. This was a tone, a steady, unwavering C-sharp that held its frequency with impossible precision. Eris sat up, his fatigue forgotten. He checked for satellite interference, for military radar, for any of the 1,000 human-made signals that often polluted his data. There was nothing. This was coming from deep space, from a point near the star system, Gliese 581, over 20 light-years away, for 6 minutes and 11 seconds. The tone continued, a beacon of perfect order in the cosmic noise. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it vanished, leaving only the familiar hiss in its wake. Eris knew the protocols. He knew he should report it, notify the SETI Institute, and keep it confidential. But the sheer perfection of it, beauty of that single note echoing across light years, captivated him. He made a copy of the data, a personal keepsake of his first and only conversation with the stars. He didn't know that the signal wasn't just a message, it was a key, and it had already begun to unlock parts of his mind he never knew existed. Chapter 13. The Visions in the Static. he began to dream in geometry. His sleeping mind flooded with intricate, luminous shapes that felt less like images and more like concepts, direct and understood. The signal had imprinted itself on his subconscious. Life after the signal didn't return to normal for Eris Thorne. The official investigation concluded the tone was an unexplained anomaly, likely a previously unknown type of quasi-stellar radio. Source: the file was closed. But for Eris, it was just the beginning. He started experiencing powerful, waking dreams. He'd be calibrating an instrument or writing an email, and suddenly a cascade of complex, fractal patterns would bloom behind. His eyes? They were beautiful and terrifying, a language of light and mathematics that felt instantly familiar, yet utterly alien. He began to sketch them in the margins of his notebooks, strange, twisting spirals, interconnected lattice that defied Euclidean geometry, and symbols that looked like a blend of mathematics and music. Along with the visions came a new sensitivity. He could feel the electromagnetic hum of every device around him. A functioning microwave felt like a dull pressure in his teeth. The server room was a symphony of uncomfortable vibrations. He started preferring the quiet, open desert, where the only energy was the sun and the slow turn of the planet. Most strangely, he found he could now hear the universe in a way he never could before. Sitting in his quiet home, he could close his eyes, and if he concentrated, tune into the faint background radio noise of the cosmos. It was no longer a hiss. It had texture, layers, and within it he could sometimes sense faint echoes of that original C-sharp tone, like a sonar ping, still bouncing around the galaxy. He wasn't just hearing the signal anymore. He was listening to what it was attached to. He began to understand that the tone was a carrier wave, and the real information, the profound data, was encoded in its subtle quantum fluctuations. A message, not for his equipment, but for his consciousness. The signal had rewired him, turning his mind into a living receiver for a transmission that was still ongoing. Eris knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that the signal had chosen him. It wasn't broadcast to humanity. It was sent for him, and it was inviting him to understand. Chapter 14: The Whisper in the Wilderness. Driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain, he took a leave of absence, packed his jeep, and drove deep into the desert, pulled toward a place he had only seen in his new dreams. The need to get away from the noise of civilization became overwhelming. The constant M-fields of the city were a painful cacophony in his sensitized mind. Eris Thorne, a man of logic and reason, found himself acting on pure instinct. He told his superiors he was suffering from burnout and needed time off. He packed a tent, supplies, his notebooks, and a powerful portable radio receiver, and he drove into the heart of the Gila wilderness. He didn't have a destination in mind. He simply drove, letting the strange new compass in his mind guide him. For 2 days, he camped under the vast star-dusted sky, his receiver scanning the quiet bands, listening for that familiar tone. On the third night, as he sat by a small fire, the vision hit him with more force than ever before. It was a mountain, not a dramatic peak, but a specific, solitary mesa with a distinctive, lightning-blasted juniper tree on its north face. He had seen it a dozen times in his sketches. He knew with absolute certainty that he was meant to go there the next morning. He navigated by this psychic imprint, following dirt tracks that grew fainter and fainter until he was truly in the middle of nowhere. Finally, he saw Itha Mesa from his vision, standing silent under the afternoon sun. He parked his jeep and hiked toward its base, his heart pounding, not from exertion, but from a sense of impending revelation. At the base of the mesa, nestled in a natural rock alcove, he found it. Not a spacecraft, not a weird artifact, but a place of profound silence. The electromagnetic hum that had plagued him for weeks was completely gone. It was a dead zone, a perfect void of static. In the center of the alcove, the rock was smooth, almost glassy, as if it had been melted and polished centuries ago. He set up his receiver. The speakers were silent. Then, as the last light of the sun faded, he heard it, not through the speakers, but in his mind. It was a whisper, a thought that was not his own. Asterisk, we are here. You are listening. The first step is resonance. Asterisk Eris Thorne, Ph.D., a man of science, sat down on the cold desert sand, not afraid, but awestruck. The message wasn't in words. It was a package of understanding, delivered directly into his consciousness. It spoke of a civilization that communicated not through sound or sight, but through shared consciousness, using quantum-entangled particles and the very fabric of space-time as their medium. They weren't aliens in the classic sense. They were co-inhabitants of the universe, living in dimensions that brushed against our own. Their perception of reality utterly different from ours. The signal hadn't been a hello. It had been a test, a filter to find a mind capable of resonating on the right frequency. And Eris had passed. Chapter 15. The contact of no contact. There was no ship, no handshake, no dramatic arrival. Contact was a silent, profound meeting of minds across a gulf, not of space, but of perception. Eris spent a week at the mesa. He barely slept, barely ate. He simply sat in the silent alcove, listening with his mind. The beings whom he came to think of as the Ashana name that appeared in his thoughts did not communicate in linear sentences. They shared states of being, concepts, and memories. He saw their world, a planet not of land and water, but of crystalline structures and swirling clouds of gas, where thought and matter were deeply intertwined. Their bodies were non-corporeal, patterns of energy sustained by a planetary consciousness. They were ancient, having evolved past the need for technology, for travel, for conflict. Their entire existence was a state of contemplative exploration, a journey inward through the layers of the universe's meaning. They had detected humanity's first radio broadcasts over a century ago. They listened to our wars, our music, our cries of loneliness and bursts of genius. They saw a species on the cusp, brilliant and beautiful, yet terrified and violent. They knew direct contact would shatter our world, would be misinterpreted, weaponized, or worshipped. So they chose another way. They sent the signal, a tuning fork, for the human mind. It was designed to find an individual, a single consciousness, capable of expanding to meet them, to act as a bridge. They weren't here to give us technology or save us. They were here to offer a perspective, to show us that we are not alone in the universe, and that the next great frontier for humanity isn't star travel, but consciousness itself. Eris understood his role. He was not an ambassador. He was a translator. His task was not to prove their existence to the world, but to slowly, gently introduce the concepts, the feeling of their presence through his work, through art, through music, through a new kind of theoretical physics that blended science with spirituality. The contact ended as quietly as it began. The whispering presence in his mind receded, leaving him with a profound sense of peace and a quiet hum of connection that never fully left him. He packed his camp, drove back to the world, and no one knew that the man who returned was perhaps the most important human being on the planet. He had made contact, and the message was that we are all already connected. We just have to learn how to listen. Chapter 16. The Ripple of a Whisper. He published a paper not on aliens, but on the philosophical implications of cosmic connectivity. It was dismissed by most, but a few read it and felt something shift inside them. The ripple had begun. Eris Thorne returned to his life, a changed man. The constant static of anxiety that plagues modern life was gone, replaced by that deep, resonant hum of connection. He didn't run to the media. He didn't write a sensational book. He knew that would only create noise, and the Ashana were about silence and understanding. He began to write. He published a dense academic paper in a journal of philosophy of science, titled The Resonant Universe: Consciousness as a Cosmological Constant. In it, he argued that consciousness might not be a byproduct of the universe, but a fundamental force within it, like gravity or electromagnetism. He wove in his complex geometric sketches, presenting them as theoretical models for higher dimensional thought. The scientific community largely ignored it, or dismissed it as New Age nonsense, masquerading as academia. But a few people, a neuroscientist in Switzerland, a string theorist in California, an indigenous elder who studied traditional star knowledge, read it, and they didn't just read it, they felt it. It resonated with something they had always suspected, a truth they felt in their bones. They reached out to Eris, and a quiet, scattered network of minds began to form. Eris also began to compose music, using the precise frequency of the Ishana signal as his fundamental tone. He created ambient, minimalist soundscapes. People who listened to it reported strange effects, feelings of deep calm, enhanced dreams, a sense of vastness and belonging. It became niche, underground, a secret among those who sought something more. They didn't know its origin. They just knew it made them feel less alone on this planet. He never spoke of his experience in the desert. He simply lived the message. His life became his testimony. He was calmer, more present, and possessed a wisdom that drew people to him. He would give lectures on radio astronomy, and during the Q&A, someone would inevitably ask about the possibility of extraterrestrial life. He would smile and say, "The question is not whether they are out there. The question is whether we are aware enough to perceive the ways in which they are already here. The universe is not silent. It is a conversation. We have just forgotten the language." And in the eyes of a few in the audience, he would see a flicker of recognition. The signal was being passed, not through words, but through frequency. The ripple was spreading, one mind at a time. Chapter 17. The Symphony of Spacetime. On his deathbed, an old man surrounded by his quiet network of friends, he closed his eyes for the last time, and in his mind the single tone expanded into a chord and then into a symphony. He was going home. Eris Thorne lived a long, peaceful life. He never became famous for his discovery. To the world, he was a mildly eccentric astronomer who dabbled in philosophy. But in the quiet corners of science and spirituality, he was a legend, a whispered-about figure who had glimpsed the truth. He never stopped listening. As he grew older, his sensitivity to the subtle frequencies of the world only increased. He could sit in a garden and feel the consciousness of the plants, the slow, patient thoughts of the trees, the humming communication of the insects. He understood that the Ashana hadn't given him a gift. They had simply unlocked what was already inherently human, a potential buried deep in our DNA, waiting for the right key. On his final day, he was surrounded by the small group of friends and colleagues who had come to understand his work and, on some level, his secret. There was no sadness, only a palpable sense of anticipation. He was weak, his breathing slow. He looked at them all, his eyes clear and bright, and said, "Thank you for listening. The conversation continues. Just tune to the right station." He closed his eyes, and as his physical body began to shut down, his consciousness did the opposite. It expanded. The gentle hum he had carried for decades amplified. The single, pure C-sharp note of the original signal returned. But now it was the root of something immense. Other notes joined it, a harmony of impossible complexity and beauty. He could hear the consciousness of the planet, the song of the solar system, the symphony of the galaxy. It was not an end. It was an integration. His individual awareness was merging with the vast communal consciousness of the Ashana and all that is. He was not dying. He was finally going to the place the signal had always been calling him from. He was returning to the source, to the resonant heart of a universe that is alive, aware, and forever communicating with itself. Back in the room, his friends saw him take his last breath. And at that exact moment, every one of them, though miles apart from each other later that night, had the same vivid dream. They dreamed of Aris, young and vibrant, smiling as he stood before a vast, swirling galaxy of light. He didn't speak, but they understood the message he sent them, a feeling of utter joy and an invitation. Asterisk, the frequency is open. All you have to do is listen. Asterisk, the story of Eris Thorne and the Ishana signal became another layer of the human mythos. A quiet legend for those who need to believe that the cosmos is not cold and empty, but is instead a warm, sentient sea of connection. And on quiet nights, when the world is asleep, you can almost hear it, a faint, beautiful tone just at the edge of hearing, inviting you to listen a little closer to the silence.